Out with then is the question, what is a cult? And in a broad sense, some people may say, well, somebody else's religion, any religion other than mine, that's a cult. But there are various kinds of definitions or various definitions of what a cult is. The Oxford Dictionary says it's a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. Brian Wilson, who was the Reader Emeritus in Sociology at the University of Oxford and president of the International Society for the Sociology of Religion, proposed a new means of classifying new religious movements. Wilson abandons the term cult altogether, but uses the term sect to refer to any religious movement of separated believers. So to him, cults then fall under the category of sects. Sects being a group of people that kind of start out with another group and then break away. Cults then have their own particular kind of characteristics that I kind of want to go into, but a little bit more about how people view other religions. I found an interesting quote from John Terrell, who's a pastor of Resurrection Life of Jesus Church. And he wrote that a cult, this is his words, a cult, according to the word of God, is any group of people that worship anything or anyone other than Jesus Christ and believe anything contrary to his word as found in the Bible. Well, that excludes a whole lot of people, doesn't it? Even some of the Bible writers, or it's almost as though we could say all of the Bible writers, were Jewish, but those who didn't believe in Jesus are not accepted as God's people. There are a lot of cults. The International Cultic Studies Association said that back in the 80s, there were about 5,000 groups that were called or thought of as cults. But now, in 2020, that same organization put the number at about 10,000. So a doubling of the number of cults within the last 20 years or so, 40 years. Rick Rose, executive director of the Ross Institute for the Study of Destructive Cults, Controversial Groups, and Movements, wrote that the word cult can be broadly defined as formal religious veneration, a system of religious beliefs and its body of adherents, a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, great devotion to a person or idea, as well as persons united by devotion or allegiance to an artistic or intellectual movement or figure, maybe even political. These general definitions could potentially include everything from Barbie doll collectors to so-called Trekkies and even diehard Elvis fans. If you see my wife, don't tell her about the Elvis fan bit, okay? She may not appreciate it. But when we look back over American history, there are a lot of religions that started out small and that because of their growth or because of the nature of their interaction with society have kind of become seen as legitimate religious groups or expressions. For example, the followers of Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of Christian Scientists. At one time, they were a small group considered cultish, yet now we see reading rooms for Christian Scientists throughout the country, and we find a number of people, prominent people who are Christian Scientists. The Mormons were united by their devotion to a man, to Joseph Smith. And at one time they were considered a spurious, maybe even evil cults. But now we consider them to be a mainstay of American religious life. In fact, my office is just a block away from the new Mormon temple, and I can see it out my window. So once again, then, how do we distinguish a cult from just a new religious expression? How do we identify a cult and distinguish it? Well, there are several different characteristics that cults tend to share that serve as the foundation for the development and for their growth. So I want to share these with you. I won't be able to talk a lot about each individual one, but these are the things that typically are characteristic of an organization or a group referred to as a cult. First of all, absolute authoritarianism without meaningful accountability. No tolerance for questions or critical inquiry. No meaningful financial disclosure regarding budget or expenses, such as an independently audited financial statement. Unreasonable fear about the outside world, such as impending catastrophe, evil conspiracies, and persecution. There's no legitimate reason to leave. Former followers are always wrong in leaving, negative or even evil for doing so. Former members often relate the same stories of abuse and reflect a similar pattern of grievances. There are records, books, news articles, or broadcast reports that document the abuses of the group or the leader. Followers feel they can never be good enough. The group leader is always right. And finally, the group or leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth or receiving validation. No other process of discovery is readily acceptable or credible. So, why do people join a cult? Rachel Bernstein, a marriage and family therapist who specializes in treating cult members or cult survivors and those who have loved ones in cults, wrote that a lot of people will say, "How could you have gotten involved?" And it's because you're never given all the information about a group that turns out to be a cult from the beginning. Bernstein said that, so you only have the information to go on that you've been given, which is very select, and you make your judgment based on that. No one's able to make a fully educated decision before getting involved in a cult. I'm going to address that a little bit later again. So Bernstein then posits that there are three reasons why people join a cult. Bernstein said that those who want to heal from a wound, perhaps a wound from childhood or some other past trauma, and those who want to become more productive or successful in their careers might be swayed to join an insidious organization. Her second point, they want a greater sense of community. Folks who long for greater human connection may also be more likely to fall victim to a cult. Close relationships are a human need. By capitalizing on this proclivity, cults can be that much more insidious. Sometimes people are just wanting to connect with people they think they have something in common with. And a cult provides instant community and love bombing and a language that suddenly you all speak. Bernstein said, in reference to the jargon that cults often create for their members. Third, people may be in a state of extreme vulnerability. An individual's personality and life goals aren't the only things that make them vulnerable to cults. According to Bernstein, timing also plays a role. She said her former cult member patients often tell her that they would have never joined the cult if they weren't going through a difficult life event at the time they were approached to join. And according to Bernstein, people who are recently diagnosed with terminal or chronic illnesses are living on their own for the first time, experienced the death of a loved one, or had a serious career blunder, tend to be in a fragile stress situation, and therefore might join a group that they might not otherwise acknowledge. So she concludes saying that timing plays a big part of people's susceptibility. I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience. As I mentioned earlier, the opening words, that I was married at 20 and I quit college. I was a sophomore in college and quit, even though I had my education paid for. Um, I decided to leave college. And the reason why is because I became one of Jehovah's Witnesses when I was 20. Now, whether Jehovah's Witnesses are called a cult or a sect or just another denomination depends on whose works you read. Though sometimes they're referred to as a cult, sometimes it's a sect, sometimes it's just a denomination of Christianity. But out of my own experience, I would call them a cult. I first heard about Jehovah's Witnesses from a friend of mine when I was a senior in high school. And I'd always been interested in religion, spirituality, and so I was always fascinated by the Bible. But you may or may not know that for most people who claim to be Christians, their knowledge of the Bible is very, very minimal, quite scant. But I was always interested. So one day, a friend of mine came over who had become a Jehovah's Witness over the summer in high school, and he showed me a couple of things from the Bible, and I was just blown away. That felt like he knew something, or that the organization had some sort of insight into the Bible that I had always longed for. And so he immediately, or right away, as soon as he could, he took me to they don't call their churches a church, they call them kingdom halls. He took me to the kingdom hall, and you could never go to a more friendly place. Everyone was so glad to see me, and they asked about me, and I felt like from just the very first moments of being there that everybody was my friend. Now, I didn't begin to go regularly because, well, my mother really wanted me to go to college. And there was this particular girl that was going to the same college. So I decided I better go to college. And I enjoyed my first year of college. But then I got caught up in drugs and had a very extremely severe reaction to hallucinogenics. And I thought something's got to change. I'm not going to be able to go on living the way that I've been living. And I remembered Jehovah's Witnesses. So I called them, and Jehovah's Witnesses, you can't just go and say, I want to be one. Where do I sign? You have to go through a 6-month Bible study. And very slowly, you begin to learn more and more and more. And the first step in accepting the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses is to buy into the idea that, and the term we used was, the organization has the truth. That organization is comprised of a couple of different corporations, but effectively it's men that live in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, at the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses. At the time when I started, there were 12 men, and they made decisions that affected the entirety of Jehovah's Witnesses throughout the world. And by that time, I was ready. I was ready to accept anything that I was told. I wouldn't take a blood transfusion if I needed it. I wouldn't talk or have developed relationships with anyone who wasn't a Jehovah's Witness. So that meant, that special girl, well, we parted. School at the time, Jehovah's Witnesses youth were not encouraged to attend college because it would just fill our minds with things that were not important in our service to God. Well, if you think back and if you recall some of those 10 points about the characteristics of a cult, and if you recall those 3 reasons why people join cults, I'm pretty well the picture of that during my time. But I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but it was a very, very intense time in my life. And whenever I had questions, I was told, something maybe I didn't believe or I didn't understand. I was told, well, don't worry about it because look who taught you what you already know. So if you don't know something, just wait. You'll figure it out. Or God will reveal it to you in God's own time. If you don't get the answer, that's fine. Just wait because you're beholden to the people that brought you into this special relationship with God through the organization. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jehovah's Witnesses are the only people who are going to survive a coming battle on the earth brought by God against the entire world system of things. Political, economic, cultural, and religious systems that make up the entirety of the human experience will be destroyed by God, and only the small group of people will survive. Especially culpable are clergy of the churches because they've read the Bible and they know better. So they're in the worst of positions. It made quite a stir, I understand, among some of my former associates when I began to go to seminary to become a minister. They were certain that I had joined the dark side. Some people may think that the size of the group or the number of adherents has something to do with whether a group could be called a cult. Well, let's look at the religious landscape of America just for a moment, because it is true that size often has some bearing on whether a religion is considered or a group of people or any kind of a movement might be considered cultish. Merriam-Webster defines cult as a usually small group of people that are characterized by this kind of devotion. But once again, as we look at the religious landscape in America, we see a couple things. According to the Pew Research Center's 2020 survey on religion and public life in the United States, about 70% of the population claims to be Christian, divided up between evangelical Christians, historically Protestant Christians. There are Catholic Christians, and then, of course, Mormons, Orthodox Christians, and Jehovah's Witnesses included in that group. And then about 0.3% of Americans fall under the heading of other world religions. And under other world religions, of that 0.3% of the population in the United States, 0.5% of that refers to Unitarians and New Age religions. We're lumped in with New Age religion. I'm going to make a little sidebar here. The term New Age religions, I think, is a very demeaning term. When you look at the teachings and the practices of New Age religions, they're actually Old Age religions and emerge from some of the oldest expressions of human attempts to figure out what this all means, to connect with the world, to make sense out of their lives, and perhaps try to exercise control over the things that happen to them through religious rituals and teachings and doctrines and whatever. So New Age has kind of been a demeaning term. Just wanted to mention that because it always bothers me when I hear New Age religions. That also includes Native American religions, if you're interested. So we have this very, very small group of Unitarians in the United States. In a sermon given in 2017 by Unitarian Universalist minister Reverend Scott Alexander, he brought out that back in 2017, there were about 211,000 Unitarians. That includes 150,000 adults and about 61,000 other children. So 211,000 total Unitarians. But he asked the question, did you know that there are more Americans, more than 250,000 Americans, who believe they have been abducted by aliens into spaceships than there are Unitarian Universalists? Now, that's not to demean people who feel that they were abducted by aliens, but it's generally, we think of it as being a pretty small group. And yet there are more of them, at least there were back in 2017, and I'm pretty well certain that that group has grown, that are Unitarian Universalists. So then the size of Unitarian Universalists as a religion or as a group is pretty small. And if we were to look at what determines whether something is a cult or a group, an organization is a cult, if we look purely at size, well, you know, we're pretty tiny. But who are we as Unitarian Universalists? Going to my go-to source for all information, Wikipedia, Wikipedia says, the Unitarian Universalism is a liberal religion characterized by a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Unitarian Universalists assert no creed, but instead are unified by their shared search for spiritual growth, guided by a dynamic, living tradition. Remember the 7 principles that guide Unitarian Universalists? Contrast the 7 principles that guide the way that we form our religious community as opposed to those 10 principles or characteristics of cults. The first principle says that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The second principle, justice, equity, compassion in human relations, guides and helps shape who we are as individuals and as congregations. The third principle, acceptance of one another, encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. The next one, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. What an interesting, incredible list of principles that guide and direct Unitarian Universalism. Not as a cult. We're not dependent upon that one person or that one head organization that tells us what we do. But those principles then guide us and move us towards freedom and inquiry and the finding of meaning. But we get to what I think is the most important theological question when I hear people talk about theology or religion. And the question is, so what? So what? I mean, in other words, why should I care about what you just told me? Why should I care about the 7 principles? What should I do about it? And what does this mean for Heartland Unitarian Universalist Church? What it means is that we have formed a community, a religious community, in the broadest sense of the word religion, that attempts to continue to foster and support a spiritual life, however we each individually define that life. And we have the unique opportunity to nurture freedom of thought and freedom of inquiry within a community of support. Remember those reasons why people join a cult, why they turn over their independence or free thought to some person or organization. A lot of it is because as they begin to look at the deeper things of life, they feel that they have people around them who will support that journey, even though that journey may be a dark one, even though that journey may be one that shrinks the capacity to be fully what one can be. I don't know if that language works, but maybe it does. Heartland Unitarian Universalist Church and the Unitarian Universalist Association has the opportunity to provide community, to provide support as we begin to think about how do we help other people as they journey through life to find meaning. I love how the current website of the Unitarian Universalist Association describes UU congregations. When you go to the website, on the first page that I came to, you read this invitation. It says, "Live your values aloud, not alone. Our open-minded, open-hearted spiritual communities help people lead lives of justice, love, learning, and hope. Your adventure in faith starts here." Isn't that great? Your adventure in faith, not into some narrow, predefined channel by which we have to travel, but an adventure, an adventure. And that's what then we have. We are all invited to participate with fellow travelers in this adventure in faith. To go on adventure doesn't mean that we necessarily know what we're going to encounter. We don't know what obstacles we'll face. There may be even some falling and tripping and falling back, but there's also the opportunity for that forward movement into something we may not even be able to imagine. The adventure. And in our own lives, each life, each day of life as an adventure. Also facing things we may not have been prepared for or ever expected to face. But with a community of support around us, people that we can rely on, call upon, lean on, share with, we can enjoy this adventure as we learn and grow. Your adventure in faith starts here, and it can start now. Amen.